Clara Whitfield did not flinch when the laughter hit her. She had learned after 37 years in Red Willow that flinching only gave them more. She kept her chin level, her hands loose at her sides, and she walked through the dust like a woman who had already survived everything this town had to offer, which she had. What she could not survive, she had decided, was one more Sunday of standing still while her life moved nowhere. Then the screaming started, and everything changed. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1889 came to Red Willow, Wyoming, like a debt collector, early, mean, and not interested in excuses. By the second week of July, the creek had pulled back 20 feet from its banks. The grass along the north road had gone from yellow to the color of old bone. Men gathered outside the feed store every morning and talked about the drought the way they talked about everything in that town, with great conviction and absolutely no plan. Clara Whitfield had lived in Red Willow her entire life. She knew the rhythm of its cruelty better than she knew her own heartbeat. Sunday mornings were the worst. She came down the church steps that morning the way she always did, alone. Her good dress pressed the night before with the flat iron she kept on the shelf above the stove, her hair pinned back without a single strand out of place. She was 37 years old, unmarried, and employed as the town schoolteacher, which in Red Willow, Wyoming, in the year 1889, made her approximately as desirable as a dry well in August. She knew what was coming before she heard the first whisper. "There she goes." That was Ruth Halley's voice, soft and sweet as spoiled fruit. 37 years old and still pressing that same gray dress every Sunday. Bless her heart. Clara did not slow her step. "My cousin in Cheyenne married at 22, said another voice, younger, sharper. Delia Morrison, whose husband worked the telegraph office and whose primary occupation appeared to be discussing other women's failures. Can you imagine, still alone at that age? What does she do with herself? Teaches other people's children, Ruth said. Since she'll never have any of her own, Clara's jaw tightened. That was the only thing she allowed herself, one small tightening of the jaw invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, and she wasn't giving them the satisfaction of looking. She kept walking. Behind her she heard Hank Deaver's laugh, loud, braying, the kind of laugh a man uses when he wants other men to hear how funny he is. Hank ran the livery and considered himself the wit of Red Willow, a position that required very little competition. "Hey, Miss Whitfield," he called out. "Better hurry home before the heat gets you. Wouldn't want your school books to melt." A ripple of laughter moved through the knot of people on the church steps. Clara stopped walking. She turned around slowly. She looked at Hank Deaver with the same expression she used on a student who had given her a wrong answer with complete confidence, and she said, "Thank you for the concern, Mr. Deaver. I'll be sure to keep that in mind." She turned back around. She kept walking. Behind her she heard Hank say, quieter now, to the man standing next to him, "Lord, no wonder nobody wants her." She did not stop again. She made it 2 full blocks before her hands started shaking. Bien. Clara had lived alone since her father died 6 years prior. Thomas Whitfield had been the finest horse trainer in 3 counties, cavalry-trained, soft-handed, a man who believed that an animal's fear was always the fault of the person holding the rope. He had raised Clara the same way he trained horses, with patience, consistency, and the firm conviction that dignity was not something other people could give you or take away. He had been wrong about that last part. Or at least Red Willow had spent the better part of a decade trying to prove him wrong. After Thomas died, Clara had taken the schoolteacher position because it was the only respectable employment available to a woman of her education and station. She was good at it. Her students learned to read faster, write cleaner, and think harder than the students of any other teacher the district had employed. The school board acknowledged this privately and ignored it publicly because acknowledging it would have required them to pay her more. She taught 5 days a week. She kept a small vegetable garden behind her house. She had 3 horses in the paddock her father had built, not because she needed 3 horses, but because they were the only company in Red Willow that didn't make her feel like a problem someone had forgotten to solve. She had stopped expecting things to change. That was the truth. She lived with quiet and flat as the Wyoming plain in July. She had made her peace with the life she had, which was not the same as being happy with it, but was the only honest thing she knew how to do. She was halfway through that thought, walking along the packed dirt road, with her shaking hands clasped in front of her when the screaming started. It wasn't a person screaming. It was a horse. Clara knew the difference before she consciously registered it. The pitch, the particular sound of a large animal in panic, and underneath it, the deeper sound of something breaking. Wood, probably. A fence rail or a gate. Then she heard the men shouting. She turned toward the sound without thinking. Caleb Dawson's corral sat at the north end of Main Street behind the feed store, which meant that on a Sunday morning after church services, approximately half the town of Red Willow was standing close enough to see what happened next. The Black Stallion was 17 hands of organized fury. Clara knew the horse, everyone in town knew the horse, because Caleb had brought him up from a breeder in Colorado 3 weeks ago, and the animal had not stopped trying to kill someone since the moment he arrived. He was beautiful in the way that some dangerous things are beautiful, all power and wild intent, dark as a storm cloud with eyes that told you clearly he had not accepted any terms of surrender. He had gone through the south fence rail like it was kindling. The rider, a ranch hand. Clara didn't know well, a young man named Tully, who had made the mistake of thinking confidence was the same as skill, was lying in the dirt, 10 feet away, one arm bent wrong, not moving. Caleb was in the corral, trying to get between the stallion and the rest of his horses, and the stallion was having none of it. Every time Caleb stepped forward, the animal wheeled and charged the fence line again, and the remaining boards were not going to hold. Men stood at the edges and shouted instructions at each other. Not one of them moved forward. Clara stopped at the fence. She was not thinking about Ruth Halley or Hank Deaver or the shaking in her hands. She was watching the horse. She watched the way he moved the tight circles, the weight thrown back on his hindquarters, the way his head never fully stopped scanning the crowd. Not fury, she thought, terror. Something had frightened this animal badly enough that he had broken through solid fence rail, and now he was surrounded by screaming men, which was making everything worse. She knew what her father would have done. She set her hands on the top fence rail. Miss Whitfield. That was Hank Deaver right behind her, and for once he was not laughing. Get away from there. That animal will kill you. Then you'd better be quiet, Clara said, so he can't hear you. She climbed through the fence. The screaming stopped. Not the stallion, the men. Every man standing at that fence went completely silent, the way men go silent when they've just seen something they can't explain, and can't explain why they're not stopping. The stallion saw her the moment her boots hit the dirt. He spun to face her weight forward, head high, and he screamed again, not the same scream as before. A warning. Clara heard it clearly. She stopped moving. She dropped her hands to her sides, not raised, not reaching, just loose and open at her hips. She stood with her feet apart and her weight balanced, and she looked not at the stallion's eyes, but at a point just below and to the left of his shoulder, which was what her father had taught her, because direct eye contact with a frightened horse was a challenge, and she was not here to challenge anything. She breathed out. Then she started talking. Not words the horse could understand. Words she had known since she was 9 years old, standing in this exact kind of situation with her father's hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet in her ear. Low and steady, Clara. Don't reach for him. Let him find you. He'll come when he decides to trust, and not 1 second before. Nobody's going to hurt you, she said low and level. You don't know that yet. That's all right. You don't have to know it yet. The stallion's front hoof hit the ground once. Hard. I know you're scared, she said. I know everything here looks wrong. I know you don't understand why you're here or why all these men are shouting. She paused. I don't always understand it either. The stallion's head dropped 2 inches. It was barely anything. It was everything. Behind her she heard someone say, very quietly, she thought it might have been Caleb Dawson himself, Lord Almighty. She did not look back. Come on, she said to the horse. Come on then. I'm right here." The stallion walked toward her. Not running, not charging, walking slow and deliberate the way a frightened creature moves toward the one thing in a bad situation that doesn't feel like a threat. He walked until he was close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, and then he dropped his nose and pressed it against her open palm. Clara stood very still. She heard the sound from the crowd behind her. That particular compressed sound of a group of people releasing a breath they didn't know they were holding, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, standing on a red willow street. She felt seen. Caleb Dawson had been ranching the Dawson land for 11 years, since his father passed and left it to him. And for 9 of those years, he had been the kind of man Red Willow respected, steady, hard-working, not given to complaint. His wife Eliza had died of fever 4 years ago, leaving him alone in a house that was 3 sizes too big and a ranch that required every daylight hour he had. He was 34 years old, which in Red Willow made him a catch. He knew that. He had been told it approximately 400 times by women whose primary purpose in any social gathering was to remind him of it. He was not interested in being a catch. He was interested in keeping his ranch alive through a drought that was slowly squeezing the life out of everything north of the creek road. He had been interested in the black stallion because a stallion of that bloodline properly trained would produce foals worth more than any cattle deal he could make with Preston Vale. That had been the plan anyway. Standing in the dust of his own corral, watching Clara Whitfield speak a terrified horse into stillness, with nothing but her voice and her father's patience. Caleb Dawson understood that he had not until this moment had any real plan at all. He crossed the corral carefully, not getting close enough to spook the horse, and stopped a few feet to Clara's left. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I don't know what to say." Clara kept her hand on the stallion's nose. "You don't have to say anything right now, Mr. Dawson." "Tully. I know. He needs a doctor. Someone should go for Doc Pritchard." She said it without looking at him, still focused on the horse. "He's breathing, which is the main thing." Caleb looked over his shoulder and found that 3 men had already moved toward Tully, and he felt a brief flicker of something he couldn't name, the sense that while he had been frozen, something had reorganized itself without him. "I need to get this horse into the barn," Clara said. "Is there a lead in here?" "On the post." Caleb moved to get it before he finished thinking about whether that was the right thing to do. He came back with the lead rope and held it out. Clara took it without breaking contact with the stallion, transferred her left hand to the horse's jaw, quiet and firm, and clipped the rope in a single smooth motion. The stallion flicked one ear back and stood. Clara began walking toward the barn, and the stallion walked with her like a horse that had known her for years. Caleb followed. He was aware in the distant way of a man who has just watched something remarkable, that people were still standing at the fence. He could hear them. He could hear the sound of a town recalibrating the shift from laughter to something quieter and considerably more complicated. He did not look at them. He watched Clara Whitfield walk his wild horse into a dark barn stall on the worst morning his ranch had seen in 6 months, and he thought about how he had stood on those same church steps 20 minutes ago and said nothing when Hank Deaver called after her. He had heard it. Every man on those steps had heard it. He had said nothing because saying something would have required effort and attention. He didn't have to spare, and because Clara Whitfield's dignity had not seemed in that moment to be his responsibility. Standing in the dust outside his own barn, Caleb Dawson understood with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that he had been wrong about that. Clara settled the stallion in the far stall with fresh water and the particular quality of silence that horses understand means safe. She latched the stall gate, turned around, and found Caleb Dawson standing in the barn doorway. He was a tall man, lean through the jaw, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outdoors without complaint. He held his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, which Clara recognized as the gesture of a man who was choosing his words carefully. "Your father trained horses," he said. "He did." "Cavalry trained." He worked with the army for 8 years before he started his own operation. Clara smoothed her hands on her dress, the gray dress she had pressed the night before with the flat iron. He taught me everything he knew. Caleb nodded. He was still turning his hat. I have a problem, Miss Whitfield. I noticed. I mean beyond today. He looked up then, and his eyes were direct, not unkind, not calculating, just honest in the way that men are honest when they've run out of time for anything else. That horse is worth more broke and trained than anything else on this property. But I don't have anyone who can do what you just did. My best hand is lying in the dirt with a broken arm. Preston Vale is coming to inspect this operation in 3 weeks, and if the ranch doesn't look stable... He stopped, started again. I need help. Real help. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Dawson, she said. 3 weeks ago, you were standing 15 feet away when Hank Deaver told the whole street I was going to die, married to my school books. You heard that? A muscle moved in his jaw. Yes, ma'am. You didn't say anything. No, ma'am, I didn't. So you'll understand, Clara said, why I'm not feeling particularly inclined toward charitable arrangements. She picked up her good hat from the post where she'd set it, before climbing the fence, settled it on her head, and walked past him out of the barn. The crowd at the fence had thinned, but not dispersed. People were talking in low voices. Clara walked through the space that opened for her without looking at any of them. She heard Caleb Dawson call after her, Miss Whitfield. She didn't stop. I was wrong to stay silent, he said. That's the truth, plain as I can make it. Clara stopped walking. She did not turn around. I'll consider it, she said. Then she walked home through the July heat, with her hands finally blessedly still. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, and her father's horse journals open in front of her, and she thought about Caleb Dawson's face when he said I was wrong to stay silent, the way it had cost him something, that admission. The way it had come out plain and unhidden. She thought about the black stallion pressing his nose into her palm. She thought about 3 weeks. She closed the journal. She looked out the window at the dark paddock where her 3 horses stood quiet in the summer heat, and she made herself the same promise she always made when Red Willow pushed her somewhere she didn't want to be. Not for him. Not for the town. For yourself and for the horse. She would think about it, she had said. By morning, she had already decided. Clara arrived at the Dawson Ranch before sunrise, not because Caleb had asked her to, not because they had arranged a time. She arrived because that was how her father had always done it before the heat settled in, before the ranch hands were moving, before the day had a chance to build opinions about what was and wasn't possible. She had her father's leather satchel over one shoulder, the one that still smelled faintly of saddle oil, and the particular dry grass of Wyoming summer. Inside it, a worn training journal, a soft lead, a length of cotton rope her father had braided himself, and a small tin of the mineral salt mixture he had always kept for difficult horses. She let herself through the gate and went straight to the barn. The stallion heard her before she reached the door. She heard him shift one hoof, then another, and then go still, listening. She talked before she opened the latch. "It's me," she said quietly. "Same as yesterday. Nobody here but you and me." She went in. He was watching her from the far corner of the stall, head up, ears sharp, not panicking, evaluating. Clara stood outside the stall gate and let him look at her for a full minute without moving, just standing, breathing, making herself the least threatening thing in his world. Then she sat down on the hay bale across from his stall and opened the training journal. She wasn't reading it. She had read everything in it 100 times. She was simply being present in a way that didn't demand anything, and after about 10 minutes, the stallion dropped his nose toward his water bucket and drank. That was enough for the first morning. She was latching the barn door behind her when she heard boots on the hard ground and turned to find Caleb Dawson walking toward her from the direction of the house, a tin cup in each hand, and an expression on his face that suggested he was not entirely sure this was real. "You came," he said. "I said I'd consider it." She took the cup he held out coffee black because refusing it would have been foolish and she needed it. I considered it. Caleb looked at the barn door, then back at her. How is he? He drank this morning. That's a good sign. A horse that won't eat or drink is a horse that's already given up, and this one hasn't. She sipped the coffee. He's not mean, Mr. Dawson. He's frightened. There's a difference. Tully would argue that point. Tully spurred him, Clara said. I could see the marks. Whoever sold you this horse told you he was broke to ride, and that was either a lie or the man's definition of broke was considerably different from mine. She looked at him steadily. How much did you pay for him? A pause. More than I should have. Then you need this to work. Yes, ma'am, I do. Clara handed the tin cup back. Then we need to be clear about something before I take another step. I am not here because I want anything from you, Mr. Dawson. I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not looking for anyone in this town to feel sorry for me. I'm here because that horse deserves better than what he's had, and because I know how to give it to him. Those are my terms. Caleb held her gaze. Understood. I'll come mornings before school, evenings when I can. The work will take as long as it takes, I won't rush it, and neither will you. She pulled her hat brim level. And if I hear one word about what I'm doing here turned into gossip about what I'm doing here, I'm gone. Are we clear? Clear, Caleb said. And then after a beat, Miss Whitfield, I meant what I said yesterday, about being wrong. I know you did, Clara said. That's the only reason I'm standing here. She walked back through the gate and down the road toward town and the school, and she did not look back, but she was aware the way a person is aware of heat from a fire, without looking directly at it, of Caleb Dawson, standing in his yard, watching her go. The talk started within 48 hours. Clara had expected it to take a week. Red Willow was faster than she gave it credit for. She heard the first version of it from one of her students, a girl named Ada, 9 years old, with the particular gift of repeating adult conversations in their entirety without understanding a single word of them. My mama said you're going to the Dawson Ranch every morning, Ada announced during reading hour with the air of someone delivering important news. That's correct, Clara said without looking up from the primer she was correcting. She said it ain't proper. Isn't proper, Clara said. And your mother is entitled to her opinion. She said you're chasing Mr. Dawson. Clara set the primer down and looked at Ada, who had the decency to look slightly nervous. Ada, Clara said. When you grow up, people will say things about you that aren't true. Some of those people will be women you thought were your friends. And the most important thing I can teach you, more important than reading, more important than arithmetic, is that the truth of who you are does not change based on what other people say about it. She picked the primer back up. Now open your book to page 12. Ada opened her book, but the word had gotten out, and word in Red Willow spread the way water spread on a dry flat, fast wide, and in every direction at once. By Thursday, Ruth Halley had stopped Clara outside the general store to offer what she described as a friendly concern. People are talking, Clara, Ruth said, her voice wrapped in the particular softness that preceded cruelty. Going to a widower's ranch every morning before sunrise, alone. You know how it looks. I'm training a horse, Clara said. That's what you're saying, yes. Clara looked at Ruth Halley, the careful hair, the pressed collar, the eyes that were doing rapid calculations behind their expression of concern, and felt a tiredness so deep it had no bottom. Ruth, she said, in 37 years, this town has never once given me the benefit of the doubt. I stopped expecting it a long time ago. So if you're waiting for me to defend myself to you, you're going to be standing there a good while. She walked past her into the store. Behind her, she heard Ruth say to someone she couldn't see who, well, I was only trying to help. Mason Reed was the kind of man who understood power the way a vulture understood altitude, not as something earned, but as something to circle until the right moment. He had worked the Dawson Ranch for 2 years, long enough to know its weaknesses: the south fence that needed replacing, the water channel that ran shallow in July, the gap in the east pasture where the soil was soft enough that a post wouldn't hold. He knew these things because he had cataloged them the way a man catalogs tools he might someday need. He had not liked Clara Whitfield before she climbed that fence on Sunday. After she climbed it, he liked her considerably less. "You're letting a schoolteacher train your stallion," he said to Caleb on Wednesday evening, not quite making it a question. "I'm letting the best horse handler I've seen in 10 years work with my stallion," Caleb said without looking up from the fence post he was setting. "Hand me that mallet." Mason handed it over. "People are talking. People in Red Willow talk about the weather like it's a personal insult. Hand me the other spike." "I'm just saying," Mason said, "it don't look right. Woman coming around every morning before the hands are up. Folks are going to draw conclusions." Caleb set the mallet down and looked at Mason directly. "What conclusions they draw is their business. What happens on my ranch is mine." He picked the mallet back up. "And if I hear you've been adding to those conclusions, Mason, that'll be the end of your employment here. Are we clear?" Mason smiled, not the smile of a man who had been warned, but the smile of a man who had just confirmed something he already suspected. "Clear, boss," he said. He was not clear. He was the opposite of clear. But Caleb was already back at work, and Mason Reed had learned a long time ago that the best time to move was when the other man's hands were full. By the end of the first week, the stallion would take an apple from Clara's palm. By the end of the second week, he would follow her to the near fence line and back without a lead rope moving with her, the way horses move with people they have decided to trust. Not because they have been forced to, but because the alternative has started to seem unnecessary. Caleb watched most of this from a distance, because Clara had been specific: no hovering, no suggestions, no well-intentioned interference. He had agreed to this because he had no better plan, and because watching from a distance was turning out to be unexpectedly instructive. He watched how she moved the economy of it. Nothing wasted, every gesture deliberate. He watched how she read the horse's reactions before they became actions, the way she adjusted without appearing to adjust. He had been around horses his entire life, and he had never seen anyone work with them the way Clara Whitfield did, not as an animal to be controlled, but as a mind to be understood. One evening, 11 days into the arrangement, he walked out to the paddock fence where she was putting the stallion through a quiet groundwork pattern and said without planning to, "My father used to say that the best horsemen were the ones who were afraid of nothing." Clara kept her eyes on the stallion. "Your father was wrong." That surprised him enough that he didn't speak for a moment. "The best horsemen," Clara said, "are the ones who understand fear well enough to work through it. Fear isn't the problem. Pretending it isn't there, that's the problem." She paused. "Your stallion isn't brave. He's learning that being afraid doesn't have to mean running. That's different." Caleb thought about that for longer than the conversation probably warranted. "What do you call him?" he asked. "I call him whatever comes to mind in the moment," she said. "Mostly I call him friend, because that's what I'm asking him to be." Caleb leaned his forearms on the fence rail. "What would you name him if he were yours?" Clara finally looked at him, just for a second, the way she looked at things she wasn't sure she trusted. "I'd call him Meridian," she said. "It's the highest point of the day. After that, everything is still possible, but you know where you stand." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "That's a good name," Caleb said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." She walked Meridian back to the barn and did not say anything else, but Caleb stood at the fence for another 10 minutes after she was gone, turning the word over in his mind, like something worth keeping. The first time Preston Vale came to the ranch, Clara was there. She had not planned to be visible. She had come for an evening session and lost track of the light, the way people do when they are paying attention to something that matters. She heard the wagon, before she saw it came out of the barn, to find a man in an expensive coat climbing down from a very clean rig, and understood immediately from the set of Caleb's shoulders that this was not a social call. Preston Vale was 52, well-fed, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came not from competence, but from money, the specific confidence of a man who had learned early that most problems yielded to sufficient financial pressure. He saw Clara and stopped. "Well," he said, and the word had a whole conversation in it. "This is Miss Clara Whitfield," Caleb said, and his voice was level. "She's working with my stallion. Is she?" Preston's eyes moved from Clara back to Caleb with the smooth calculation of a man doing arithmetic. "I didn't know you'd hired a horse trainer." "I engaged one," Caleb said. "There's a difference." Preston smiled at that, the smile of a man who files things away. He turned to Clara with an exaggerated courtesy that was its own kind of insult. "Miss Whitfield, forgive the interruption. I'm Preston Vale. I have a business interest in this operation." "I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Vale," Clara said. "Then you know this ranch is operating under some financial pressure." He let that sit a moment. The investors need to see stability, a functioning operation, strong management. His eyes moved to her dress, the working dress, not the Sunday dress with the dust on the hem and the rolled-up sleeves and back to her face. "I'd think carefully about what kind of picture certain arrangements might paint to outside eyes." "What certain arrangements are you referring to?" Clara asked. "A single woman. Daily visits to a widower's property." He shrugged pleasantly. "I'm just speaking plainly as a friend." "You're speaking," Clara said, "as a man who thinks a woman's presence somewhere requires an explanation." She looked at him without expression. "My arrangement with Mr. Dawson is professional. I am training his horse. The horse will be ready for the cattle drive demonstration in time for your inspection. That is the only picture relevant to your investment, Mr. Vale." A pause. Preston looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, but he had moved only slightly, only a single step. But he had moved to stand beside Clara rather than across from her, and that step was not lost on anyone present. "Well," Preston said pleasantly, "I look forward to the demonstration." He climbed back into his rig and left. Caleb waited until the sound of the wheels faded. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "Don't apologize for other men's behavior," Clara said. "It makes it seem like you think it's yours to apologize for." "I do think some of it is mine," Caleb said quietly. "I brought that man's money into my operation. Every condition that comes with it is something I chose." Clara looked at him. He had surprised her again, that plain honesty appearing in the gap between the things he might have said instead. "Fair enough," she said. She went back into the barn and did not let him see her expression, which had done something she was not prepared to allow it to do. The sabotage began in the third week. It started small enough that it could have been accident a gate latch left undone in the east pasture. 3 of the strongest fence posts in the south run wobbled loose from the ground. Caleb reset the posts and said nothing, because ranches had 100 small failures on a good week, and there was no sense manufacturing problems where there might be none. Then the water channel ran half its normal flow for 2 days running, and that was harder to explain away. Clara was the one who walked the channel to its source and found the blockage not a natural one, not debris from the drought, but a deliberate stacking of stones that someone had taken care to arrange where the channel narrowed and the obstruction would be hardest to spot. She pulled the stones out herself one at a time without saying a word to anyone until the water was running clean again. Then she went to find Caleb. She found him in the south pasture with Mason Reed, the 2 of them mending a section of fence that had come down overnight. She looked at the fence. She looked at the fresh cuts on 2 of the post cuts, not breaks, the kind of damage that came from a blade, not from rot or weather, or the simple bad luck of Wyoming summer. She looked at Mason Reed. He met her eyes with a bland smile that told her everything she needed to know. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "can I speak with you a moment?" Caleb handed his end of the wire to Mason and walked over. Clara kept her voice low. "The water channel was blocked, not by accident." She paused. "These posts didn't fail on their own either." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at the posts at the cuts she had already identified, and she watched comprehension move through his face, the particular discomfort of a man realizing the problem he assumed was outside his fence is actually inside it. "You're sure?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I spent 20 years learning to read what horses do and why they do it," she said. "I can tell the difference between an accident and a choice." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Behind him, Mason had gone very still in the way of someone pretending not to listen. "I'll handle it," Caleb said. "Handle it carefully," Clara said. "Because Preston Vale's inspection is in 11 days, and whoever is doing this knows that timeline as well as you do." She walked back to the barn. Behind her, she heard Caleb say in a voice she had not heard from him before, low and very cold, "Mason, set that wire down." She did not hear what came next. She did not need to. That evening, Clara was brushing Meridian when Caleb came into the barn and sat down on the hay bale across from the stall, the same hay bale she had sat on the first morning, which she noted without saying so. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just put it down to check its weight. "I confronted Mason," he said. "He denied it." "Of course he did. I can't let him go without proof. He knows enough men in this county that firing him on suspicion would make the situation worse before the inspection." Clara kept working the brush along Meridian's shoulder. The horse had his eyes half closed, the expression horses wore when they felt safe enough to be drowsy. She thought about what her father would have said. A contented horse is its own argument. "Then watch him," she said. "He'll do it again because men like that always do. They believe they're invisible. That's usually what undoes them. You know men like that." "I've lived in Red Willow my whole life," Clara said. "I know every variety." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What made you stay all these years? You could have gone to Cheyenne or Denver or—" "This is my father's land," Clara said simply. "His paddock, his barn, his horses. He built everything he had here. I wasn't going to let this town run me off the one thing left of him." Something moved through Caleb's face. "That's more courage than most people have," he said. "It's not courage," Clara said. "It's stubbornness. There's a difference." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen it, just the edge of it, brief and unguarded, and it surprised her the same way Meridian had surprised her the first morning he drank. "Preston wants to come back Friday," Caleb said. "He wants to see the horse work. Not full demonstration, just enough to judge whether the training is going to be viable." Clara nodded. "Meridian will be ready." "I know he will." Caleb stood and put his hat on. "I didn't know it when I asked you, Miss Whitfield. I know it now." He walked to the barn door and then stopped and turned back. "For what it's worth," he said. "Mason had plenty to say when I confronted him. None of it about the fence. Most of it about you." Clara stilled. "He said the town was right, that you were here for reasons that weren't professional." Caleb's voice was even. "I told him that any man who confused a woman's competence with desperation was a man who'd never met a woman with actual competence." He paused. "I thought you should know I said that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. Not warmly, she wasn't there yet, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But honestly. Caleb nodded once and walked out. Clara turned back to Meridian, who had opened his eyes and was watching her with the patient, steady attention of a creature that did not understand the complexity of people, but accepted it without judgment. "Don't look at me like that," she told him. Meridian blinked. Outside, the July heat was settling toward night, the kind of thick, breathless dark that came before a storm, and somewhere to the west, far off enough that it was just a feeling, rather than a sound, thunder was beginning to make promises about the week ahead. Clara finished with the brush and latched the stall. She stood for a moment in the quiet of the barn and let herself think just for one unguarded second about what it had felt like when Caleb Dawson took one step sideways to stand next to her. Then she picked up her satchel and walked home through the heavy dark, and she told herself it was the incoming weather that was making the air feel different. She almost believed it. The thunder that had been making promises all week finally came due on Friday morning. Clara heard it before dawn, not close yet, but close enough that she could feel it in the way the air pressed against her skin when she stepped outside. The horses in her paddock were restless, moving in tight circles, and she spent 20 minutes with each of them before she walked to the Dawson Ranch, talking them down the same way she always did. Her voice low and unhurried while everything in the sky told a different story. Preston Vale was coming today. She had not slept well. Not because of Preston, she had handled men like Preston Vale her entire life, men who measured a woman the way they measured livestock by utility and market value, and whether the numbers justified the investment. She had learned to stand in front of that kind of measurement without flinching. What kept her awake was something harder to name: the knowledge that today everything she had built over 3 weeks in that barn could be taken apart in 20 minutes if the wrong thing happened. She would not let the wrong thing happen. She found Meridian already awake, already alert, ears moving like antennae tracking the approaching weather. She went into the stall without hesitating, sat on the low stool she had started keeping there, and talked to him the way her father had taught her, not about horses, not about training. Just ordinary talk, the sound and rhythm of a human voice that meant no harm. "Big day," she told him. "We've had bigger. You don't know that yet, but I do." Meridian dropped his nose to her shoulder. She closed her eyes for just a second and let herself feel that the weight of his trust, the specific gravity of an animal that had decided she was safe, and then she stood up and got to work. Caleb was in the yard when the first ranch hands began arriving at 7, and Clara could see from the set of his jaw that he had not slept either. He had the kind of stillness that men wore when they were running on nerves and refusing to show it, every movement deliberate, every word economical. Mason Reed arrived with the others. He did not look at Clara. He had not looked directly at her since the afternoon Caleb confronted him, which told her more than eye contact would have. A man who couldn't meet your eyes was a man still thinking. That worried her more than anger would have. "He's ready," Clara said to Caleb when she fell into step beside him crossing the yard. "Whatever the weather does, Meridian will hold. He trusts the voice, not the sky." Caleb nodded. "Preston's bringing 2 men with him, business partners from Cheyenne. He wants to see the Stallion worked in the South Paddock enough to show soundness and responsiveness. That's all I need." "The South Paddock fence." Caleb paused. "I checked it myself this morning. Every post." Clara looked at him. He looked back. The understanding between them was quiet and complete. He had checked it because of what she had found in the water channel, because of the fresh cuts she had shown him, because he was no longer willing to assume that damage on his property was accidental. "Good," she said. She went back to the barn and ran through the groundwork one more time with Meridian, keeping it calm and methodical, the routine they had built together over 3 weeks. The routine that told him reliably, and without variation, that the world was manageable and she was proof of it. The Stallion moved with her like a conversation. Preston Vale arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 men she didn't know and an air of authority he wore the way some men wore expensive coats, as a warning. He greeted Caleb with the handshake of a man confirming ownership. He acknowledged Clara with a nod that managed to convey both courtesy and dismissal simultaneously, which she suspected took practice. The 2 men from Cheyenne, introduced as Hartwell and Briggs investors with cattle interests in 3 counties, looked at Meridian the way men looked at expensive things they were considering purchasing. They looked at Clara the way men looked at unexpected complications. She tacked Meridian in the barn with calm, efficient movements, feeling their eyes on her back the entire time, and she made herself move slower than she wanted to, because rushing was what they expected of someone who felt watched, and she had stopped performing for audiences who wanted her to fail a long time ago. She led Meridian into the South Paddock. The sky to the west had gone the color of a bruise. She heard Hartwell say something to Briggs low, and Briggs laugh. She did not hear the words. She did not need to. "Miss Whitfield." Preston's voice carried the particular projection of a man accustomed to being heard. "The weather looks uncertain. Perhaps a brief demonstration given the conditions." "The conditions are fine," Clara said and began. What happened in the next 15 minutes was the thing Clara's father had spent his life trying to explain to people who thought horse training was about dominance. It was not about dominance. It was about language learning to speak in a way another species could understand and listening for the answer. Meridian moved through the pattern she asked of him with the fluid attention of an animal that had decided this work was worth doing. Transitions clean and willing, his whole body organized toward her ask. She heard the silence fall over the fence line, the same way it had fallen over the crowd on Sunday morning, and she felt the same thing she had felt then. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of quiet satisfaction that she had learned not to name too loudly in case it disappeared. Preston said nothing for a full minute after she brought Meridian to a square halt. Then, "I'll grant you that's impressive. That's a $40,000 horse," Hartwell said to Caleb, and the number landed in the yard like a stone in still water. Caleb's expression didn't change. "I know what he's worth." "Then you know what a sound training program is worth." Hartwell looked at Clara with the sudden reassessment of a man revising a column of numbers. "How much longer before he's ready to breed?" "Another 3 weeks for full confidence under a stranger's hand," Clara said. "He'll be ready." Preston smiled the smile she had already learned meant he was about to redirect something. "Well, the numbers certainly work. The question of management continuity is important to our investment group, of course. Stability." He looked between Caleb and Clara with transparent calculation. "A formal arrangement might resolve certain concerns about the operations." "The operation is managed by me," Caleb said. "The horse program is under Miss Whitfield's professional direction. That's the arrangement. It doesn't require anything else." Preston absorbed this. "Of course," he said pleasantly. The first real crack of thunder hit 20 minutes later. It wasn't a warning thunder. It was the kind that arrived as a statement of intent, a single massive percussion that rolled across the sky and shook the ground beneath it, and in its wake, every animal on the Dawson Ranch reacted simultaneously. Meridian threw his head. Clara had her hand on his lead, and she moved with him, talking fast and low, keeping the line between them from becoming a fight. He was frightened, but he was not gone. She could feel the difference, the question in his tension, rather than the blind surge of panic. "Stay with me," she said to him, sharp and clear. "Stay." He steadied, barely. In the pasture, the cattle had begun to move. What happened next was the kind of disaster that unfolds faster than thinking several things at once. None of them individually catastrophic, all of them together producing something that required immediate decisions from people who had not planned for this particular configuration of problems. The south fence went down. Not all of it. One section, 2 posts, the exact section that Clara had watched Caleb inspect that morning. The posts had not been fully compromised when Caleb checked them. She understood that in the half-second she had to process it, which meant they had been compromised after. Which meant Mason Reed had found his window. The cattle surged through the gap toward the creek road. The creek road where Preston Vale's wagon was standing. Where Hartwell and Briggs had left their horses tied. Where at this particular hour on a Friday morning, 3 women from town who had come to the ranch to discuss a supply order with Caleb's housekeeper were standing in the direct path of 400 pounds of frightened cattle moving fast. Caleb was running before Clara finished the thought. She saw him go for the gate at the corner of the south pasture, trying to cut the herd before it reached the road, and she saw the ground give way under his left boot, the soft patch near the east post, the ground that didn't hold, and she watched him go down hard into the mud, and she heard the sound he made, and she knew from that sound that he was not getting up in the next 30 seconds. The men from Cheyenne had stopped moving. Preston Vale had taken 3 steps backward toward his wagon. Mason Reed, she saw in one sharp glance, was standing at the far edge of the yard, doing nothing at all. Clara handed Meridian's lead to the nearest post, not tied, just draped, trusting 3 weeks of work and the stallion's own good sense, and she ran. She did not run toward the cattle. She ran back to the barn. She was inside and back out in 45 seconds with the long cotton rope her father had braided, the one she kept in her satchel, the one she had used for groundwork since the first week. She did not know exactly what she was going to do with it. She knew what needed to happen, And she knew what tools she had, and she had learned from her father that the gap between those two things was where courage either showed up or it didn't. She found Meridian exactly where she had left him. Lead, draped over the post ears, pinned trembling at each new percussion from the sky, but standing. Standing because she had asked him to, and because he had decided 3 weeks ago that she was worth listening to. "All right, friend," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to make it. "I need you to trust me one more time, that's all. Just one more time." She went up onto the fence rail, no saddle, no stirrup, nothing her father would have approved of, and slid onto Meridian's back. He didn't bolt. He shuddered once full body, and then he was still. "Good boy," she breathed. "Good boy. Now come on." She asked him forward with her legs, and he moved not smoothly, not willingly, but he moved, which was the thing that mattered, which was the whole argument of the last 3 weeks expressed in one frightened, trusting step. She guided him along the fence line toward the gap in the south run, moving parallel to the cattle rather than into them, getting herself between the herd and the creek road before the lead animals reached the turn. She could hear the women on the road voices rising, and she could hear Preston Vale shouting something, and she could hear the cattle, and underneath all of it, the rolling percussion of the storm, making good on every promise it had made all week. "Hey!" Her voice went up and out, carrying over the noise the way her father had taught her, not screaming, not panicking, but projected authoritative, the voice that meant this direction. She swung the rope in a wide arc over her head. "Hey! Hey!" The lead steer checked. Just for a second, head up, eyes rolling, reading the new information of a horse and a person suddenly between him and where he thought he was going. Clara kept moving, kept the rope going, kept her voice steady. The herd shifted. Not a clean redirect. Nothing about it was clean. Nothing about it was what anyone would have planned or practiced. But it shifted, the mass of it turning like water, finding a new channel away from the road and back toward the gap in the north fence, where the pasture opened wide and the ground was flat. Meridian did not break. He moved with her ask the entire time, and Clara kept one hand in his mane and one hand on the rope and talked to him without stopping. The low, constant voice that meant, "You're safe, you're doing right, I'm here." And he carried her through it. The last of the cattle cleared the road. Clara brought Meridian to a halt and sat there for a moment, her whole body shaking, the rope slack in her hands, the storm screaming overhead. Caleb was on his feet by the time she rode back. He was limping the ankle, she thought, not the knee, which mattered, and his face was the color of a man who had spent the last 4 minutes watching something happen that he had no power to stop. He reached up and took her arm as she slid down from Meridian's back, not because she needed it, but because he needed to, and she understood the difference. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She checked Meridian. First ran her hands down each leg, checked his breathing, his eyes the set of his ears. He had come down, he was present. "Are you—" "My ankle. Nothing broken." Caleb's voice was rough. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land the same way the thunder had, as a statement, not a question. "The women on the road," she said. "Safe. Preston and his men got them clear before the herd turned." He was still looking at her with that expression, the one she couldn't quite categorize, too raw to be gratitude, too steady to be shock. "You rode him bareback, in a storm, into a stampede." "I worked with what was available," Clara said. "You saved those women. You saved my ranch." His jaw tightened. "You saved everything." She handed him Meridian's lead and turned toward the gap in the south fence, because there was something she needed to do before she let the moment become anything other than what the facts required it to be. She walked to the downed posts. She crouched in the mud and looked at the base of the nearest one. The cut was fresh. Not the same cuts she had shown Caleb before. Those had been carefully measured, designed to look like rot or weakness. These were different. These were hurried. Someone had done this in the 20 minutes between Caleb's inspection and the moment the storm broke, working fast, because the window was closing and the opportunity was now or never. She stood up and turned around. Mason Reed was 30 feet away. He had not left. She had wondered if he would if he had enough survival instinct to read the room after what had just happened. Apparently his confidence in his own invisibility was stronger than his self-preservation. Their eyes met. She walked toward him. He said before she reached him, "Fence posts go down in a storm. Happens all the time." "These weren't storm damage," Clara said. "You cut them, the same way you cut the posts 2 weeks ago, the same way you blocked the water channel." She stopped close enough that there was no question who she was speaking to. "You've been sabotaging this ranch for weeks, and you've been doing it in a way you thought no one would prove." "That's a serious accusation," Mason said. His voice was easy, but his eyes had gone flat. "From a schoolteacher who showed up here 3 weeks ago chasing a widower." "You can say that," Clara said. "You can say it all you want. But those posts will tell the truth whether you do or not." She turned and walked back to where Caleb was standing. She did not need to tell him. She watched his face as he looked from her to Mason and back, and she saw the moment the full picture assembled itself, the weeks of small damage, the escalation, the timing of today. "Mason," Caleb said. His voice had gone very quiet. Mason opened his mouth. "Don't." Caleb took 2 steps toward him, and whatever was in his face in that moment caused Mason Reed to take 1 step back, which was the first honest thing he had done all day. "I'm going to look at those posts, and then you and I are going to have a conversation in front of every man on this property." Preston Vale made his move in the aftermath, while the storm was still loud overhead, and the mud was still fresh, and the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes was still making everyone's hands unsteady. That was when men like Preston moved in the gap between crisis and clarity, when the numbers were rearranging themselves, and people hadn't yet decided what they thought. He found Caleb while Caleb was still limping toward the downed fence, and said with the warmth of a man offering a life raft, Hell of a morning, Caleb. Look, here's how I see this. The horse program is clearly viable. That was an extraordinary demonstration under the circumstances. But investors want stable management. They want a settled operation." He paused. "Miss Whitfield has proven her value here beyond any doubt. Formalize it. Make the arrangement official in a way the county understands. Marry the woman. Bring her into the operation properly. It solves half a dozen problems at once." Caleb stopped walking. He turned to look at Preston with the particular stillness of a man deciding how much of what he's thinking to say out loud. "Clara Whitfield just rode a Greenbroke Stallion bareback into a cattle stampede in a thunderstorm to save 3 women your wagon blocked on the road," Caleb said. "And your response is that she'd be useful to marry." Preston spread his hands. "I'm speaking practically. She is not a solution to a management problem," Caleb said. "She is not a bargain, and she is not a tool, and she is not available for any man's convenience, including mine." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "If your investment in this operation requires me to treat her like one, then we are done. You can find another ranch." Preston's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did. "That's a significant financial decision," he said. "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." He turned and kept walking toward the fence. Clara heard it from 15 feet away. She had not meant to be close enough to hear she had been checking the second downed post crouched in the mud, with her hands in the dirt, cataloging the evidence, the same methodical way her father had taught her to catalog everything. She had heard the conversation, the way you hear something in a dream present, but not fully processed, arriving piece by piece. She sat back on her heels. Around her the storm was beginning to ease. The thunder was moving east, the worst of it past, and in its wake came a particular quiet, the kind that arrived after violence, when the world was deciding what shape it wanted to take next. She heard Caleb's boots in the mud and did not look up until he stopped beside her. "He's gone," Caleb said, "or he will be soon as his wagon makes the turn." "I heard what you said to him." A pause. "I know." "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Caleb said. "I did." She finally looked up at him. He was standing in the aftermath of the worst morning his ranch had seen in years. Ankle hurt. Coat caked in mud. Two investors almost certainly reconsidering their position, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had been carrying the same one for the last 3 weeks without letting anyone see it. "The posts are the proof you need," she said, because they both needed to be standing on practical ground right now. "Fresh cuts, different angle than the storm damage on the rails. You get the sheriff out here, and Mason doesn't have an explanation that holds. I'll send a man for the sheriff before the hour's out." Good. She stood up. Her dress was past saving red mud from hem to knee, one sleeve torn at the shoulder from the fence rail. She looked down at it for a moment, and then she looked up at the crowd that had gathered ranch hands, the women from town who had been on the road. Hartwell and Briggs still standing by their horses, and a loose gathering of people who had come up the road during the storm and stayed for the aftermath. All of them watching her. The woman who had been laughed off the church steps 2 weeks ago, standing in Caleb Dawson's field, in a ruined dress with mud on her hands, having just stopped a stampede on a horse she'd trained from panic to partnership in 21 days. Ruth Halley was in the crowd. Clara saw her clearly. Ruth was not laughing. Clara straightened her spine, settled her weight on both feet, and looked back at all of them. Not with triumph, not with anger, just with the plain steadiness of a woman who had long since stopped needing their approval and had simply today also stopped pretending that their disapproval hadn't cost her anything. Then she turned back to Caleb. "I'll come Monday to check on Meridian," she said. "Let him settle over the weekend. Clara." He said her name again and again. It landed the way it had before, direct and careful, and meant, "Stay, please." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "For a little while." She walked with him toward the barn, and behind them the crowd murmured, and above them the storm finished its exit, and somewhere in the east, through the breaking clouds, the afternoon sun was beginning to make its own argument about what came next. The sheriff came that same afternoon. His name was Tom Bridle, a broad, unhurried man who had been enforcing the law in Red Willow County for 14 years and had developed the particular patience of someone who had heard every version of every story and was waiting for the one that matched the physical evidence. He looked at the fence posts for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Mason Reed, who was still on the property, because Caleb had told him in terms that left no room for interpretation that he was not to go anywhere until the sheriff arrived. Mason had spent the intervening hour rebuilding his story. Clara could see it in the way he held himself, the careful ease, the prepared expressions, the posture of a man who had decided that confidence was indistinguishable from innocence if you committed to it fully enough. "Storm damage," Mason said when Bridle asked him directly. "I've seen posts go down like that before. Ground gets soft, the wind gets under the rail. These cuts are angled upward," Bridle said without heat. "Storm damage pulls downward. Wood failure goes horizontal." He did not look up from the post. "You want to try again?" Mason's jaw moved. Nothing came out. "I also talked to those women who were on the creek road," Bridle said. "And I talked to Mr. Vale's men who confirmed the fence was standing at 9:15 this morning." He finally looked up. "Mr. Dawson checked these posts himself at 9. Which means somebody got to them in the 20-minute window between 9 and 9:20, right when the storm broke, and every man on this property had his eyes on the sky." He tucked his notebook into his coat. "That's a small window, Mason. Requires someone who knew the timeline, knew the property, and was counting on the storm to cover the evidence." Mason said nothing, but his hands, Clara noticed, had stopped being still. "I'm going to need you to come with me," Bridle said. "We can finish the conversation in town." What happened next was fast and graceless, the particular ugliness of a man whose plan has collapsed and who makes one last reaching grab for the narrative before it gets away from him entirely. Mason looked at Clara. He looked at her the way men look at the thing they've decided is responsible for their own failures. "She set me up," he said. "She's been working this ranch for 3 weeks trying to get her hooks into Dawson, and when I called it what it was, she decided to make me the problem. You really going to take the word of a dried-up schoolteacher over a 2-year ranch hand who—" "Mason." Caleb's voice was flat and final. Mason stopped. That's the last thing you're going to say about her, Caleb said. In front of me or anywhere else. Do you understand me? The quiet that followed was the kind that made people look at their boots. Mason left with the sheriff without another word. Clara watched the wagon roll down the road and felt something unclench in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 weeks. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first loosening of it, the beginning of the space where relief would eventually live. You all right? Caleb said beside her. Yes, she said. And then because it was true, and because she had decided she was done performing composure she didn't feel, ask me again in an hour. He almost smiled. I'll do that. The story moved through Red Willow the way all real stories moved, faster than the people in them, and considerably less accurate. By Sunday morning, 3 separate versions were in circulation, one in which Clara had single-handedly stopped a stampede of 60 cattle, one in which Caleb had proposed marriage on the spot after the storm, and one circulated primarily by Hank Deaver that suggested the whole thing had been exaggerated, and the cattle had mostly stopped on their own. Hank Deaver's version had the shortest lifespan of the 3, because the women who had been standing on the creek road when 400 pounds of frightened beef came around the turn were very specific about what they had seen, and they were not women who appreciated having their experience minimized by a man who had been standing safe behind a fence rail at the time. Ruth Halley did not circulate any version. Ruth Halley, for the first time in Clara's memory, was quiet. Clara learned this secondhand. She was not at church that Sunday because she was at the ranch checking on Meridian, who had come through the storm and the stampede with nothing worse than a bruised shoulder and the understandable opinion that Fridays were best avoided. She ran her hands over him methodically and spoke to him in the low continuing way that had become their language, and she let the quiet of the barn be what it was, the one place in Red Willow that had never required her to be anything other than competent. Caleb found her there the same way he always did, moving across the yard with that particular walk of his, unhurried but purposeful, a man who had somewhere to be and was choosing this direction. He was not limping anymore. The ankle had been a bad sprain, not a break, and he had apparently decided that sufficient stubbornness was an adequate substitute for the rest he hadn't taken. People are talking, he said from the barn doorway. People are always talking, Clara said without turning around. Different kind of talking this time. She heard something in his voice, a gravity she hadn't heard before, and she turned. He was holding a folded document. Legal paper, she could see the format from across the stall, the particular weight of official business. He held it out. She crossed the stall and took it, unfolded it. It was a contract. A formal legal contract drawn up by the county's land and property attorney. She recognized the office letterhead outlining a professional partnership for the horse training and breeding program of the Dawson Ranch. 2 parties. Equal division of net proceeds from any horse sold or trained under the program. Her name in print on the second line in ink. Clara Whitfield. She read it twice, not because she hadn't understood the first time, but because she needed the second pass to confirm she was reading what she was reading and not what she wanted to see. I had it drawn up Thursday, Caleb said, before the storm, before any of Friday happened. He paused. I want you to know that. This isn't because of what you did Friday. It's because of what you've been doing for 3 weeks. Clara looked at the contract. She thought about her father, who had spent 20 years building something in this county and had died with nothing left of it but a paddock and 3 horses, and a daughter who had inherited his hands and his stubbornness. She thought about the school board that paid her less than she was worth and called it gratitude. She thought about Ruth Halley and Hank Deaver and every Sunday morning that had cost her something she hadn't been able to name until it was gone. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to let them do. She looked up at the barn ceiling for a moment, then back at the contract. This is a legitimate legal document, she said, because she needed to say something practical. I had 2 witnesses, and the attorney signed it, your copy to keep mine's already filed. You filed it before I agreed to it. I filed my intention to offer it, Caleb said. The partnership requires your signature to be active. I wasn't assuming anything. I just didn't want there to be any question about whether it was real." Clara looked at him. He looked back with the quiet directness that she had come to understand over 3 weeks was simply how he was made. Not performing steadiness, just built that way, the same way some horses were built for endurance rather than speed. "I'll need to read it properly," she said. "Every clause. Take as long as you need." She folded it carefully and held it against her side. "And the school board. That's your decision," he said. "The contract doesn't require you to leave teaching. It requires your time and expertise with the horses on terms you set. Everything else is yours." She had not expected that. She had been so braced for a condition for the fine print that turned generosity into obligation that the absence of it took her off guard. "Why?" she said. Not suspicion, honest inquiry. The question she had been carrying since he'd handed her a cup of coffee the morning after she said she'd consider it. Caleb took a breath. "Because my father left me this ranch, and I've spent 11 years doing right by it, and I think I've been so busy doing right by the land that I forgot to do right by the people on it." He wasn't looking away. "You came here 3 weeks ago, and you didn't ask for anything except to be treated like your work was worth something. That's not a complicated ask, Miss Whitfield. I don't know why it took this town so long to meet it." The barn was very quiet. "Clara," she said. He blinked. "My name," she said. "You've used it twice now. You might as well make it a habit." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the antechamber of one. "Clara," he said, "will you read the contract and sign it if you find it satisfactory?" "Yes," she said. "I will." She signed it Monday morning at her own kitchen table with her father's pen. She read every clause twice, found 2 she wanted, adjusted a provision about liability that favored him too broadly, and a term on the breeding proceeds that hadn't accounted for her feed costs, and she wrote the adjustments in the margin in her schoolteacher's clear hand and sent it back with a note saying she would sign the revised version when she saw it. Caleb sent the revised version back the same afternoon, with both adjustments incorporated exactly as she had written them. No argument, no reduction. She signed it. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and even if she had been her father, had taught her to keep her most important feelings private, because they were the ones that mattered most and deserved the most protection. But she sat at that table for a few minutes after she signed with the pen in her hand and the afternoon light coming through the window, and she let herself feel the full weight of it, the years, the cost of them, and the strange, terrifying grace of something finally going right. The town did not transform overnight. Towns never did. What happened was smaller and more real than transformation. Individual adjustments person by person, each one made in private and expressed in small public gestures. Delia Morrison sent her daughter to Clara for reading help, which was framed as a tutoring arrangement, but which both women understood to be something else. 3 ranchers north of town asked for Clara's assessment of horses they were considering purchasing. She gave her opinion plainly, without hedging, and 2 of the 3 took her advice and were glad of it. The school board offered her a raise. Not what she was worth. The school board was constitutionally incapable of that level of reckoning, but more than before, and offered with a formality that suggested they had finally registered she had options. And Ruth Halley stopped her outside the general store one morning, with an expression Clara had never seen on her face before, uncertain. "I heard what happened Friday," Ruth said. "With the cattle, and with Mason Reed." "Most of Red Willow heard," Clara said neutrally. Ruth's hands moved on her basket. "I want to say, that is, I think I owe you." She stopped, started again. "I haven't always been kind to you, Clara. I want you to know I'm aware of that." Clara looked at her. Ruth Halley, who had spent the better part of a decade contributing to the small, ongoing erosion of Clara's dignity, was standing on a public street, telling her she was aware of it. That was not an apology. Clara knew the difference, but it was the beginning of accountability, and she had learned enough about the distance between the two to respect the distance rather than pretend it wasn't there. "I appreciate you saying so, Ruth," she said. Not warmly, but honestly. She walked on. She did not need Ruth Halley's regret to complete anything in herself. What she needed was already filed in a county attorney's office, with her name on the second line. The hardest morning came 12 days after the storm, and it arrived not from any enemy, but from Caleb himself, which was the thing she had not prepared for. He had asked her to look at a young mare he'd been thinking of adding to the breeding program, a bay 3 years old, with the good bone structure and the uncertain disposition that often came together in horses, bred for speed over temperament. Clara came to evaluate and stayed because the mare was more interesting than she'd expected. And the morning turned into an afternoon, the way mornings did when the work was good. They were at the paddock fence when Caleb said without building to it, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly if it's out of line." Clara set her hands on the rail. "All right." "Do you—" He stopped. She had never seen him search for words before. He was a man who used them sparingly and found them easily, and watching him unable to locate the ones he needed told her more than whatever the words would have said. "Do you think you could be happy here?" She was quiet. "Not the contract," he said quickly. "Not the work. That's not what I mean. I mean—" He exhaled. "I mean here, on this land, in this life." A pause. "With me." The sun was going down. The bay mare was watching them both with the patient attention of an animal waiting for the humans to figure out what they were doing. Clara thought about every morning she had walked to this ranch before sunrise. She thought about coffee drunk standing up in a yard while the day was still deciding what it would be. She thought about the name Meridian, and how she had said it, and he had said, "That's a good name," and how that small exchange had lodged itself in her memory with the weight of something that mattered. She thought about loneliness, not the performance of it, not the version she showed the town, but the real version, the one that lived in a house with 3 horses and a pressed Sunday dress and a cold cup of tea, the one she had made her peace with and called her life. "Caleb," she said, "I have spent 37 years being practical about everything that hurt. I don't know how to do this the other way." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do it the other way. I'm asking you to do it your way." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to need saving," he said. "I'm not asking you to be grateful or convenient or to make my operation look respectable or any other reason a man might give that isn't the true one." His voice was steady. "The true one is that you are the most honest person I have ever met, and the most capable and the bravest, and I would like if you are willing to spend the rest of my life trying to be worth standing next to." Clara felt something move through her that she did not have a name for. Not joy, exactly, not relief exactly, but something that contained elements of both and had been waiting, apparently, for a very long time. "I'm going to need you to keep being like this," she said. "This direct, this plain. I don't do well with people who say one thing and mean another." "I don't know how to be any other way," he said. "Good." She looked back at the mare. "Then yes. I think I could be happy here." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he put his hand on the fence rail next to hers, close but not touching, and stood there with the quiet of a man who understood that this exact moment was not to be rushed. "I'm glad," he said simply. The mare stretched her nose toward them, and Clara gave her a flat palm, and felt in the simple warmth of that something she recognized from her father's barn when she was small, and the world was still large and various, and full of unexpected doors. She had not felt it in a very long time. She felt it now. That evening she walked home later than usual, and the sky was doing what Wyoming skies did in July, when the drought finally broke, turning colors that had no names in any language she knew. The whole western horizon lit up with the particular extravagance of a world that had been holding its breath for weeks and was finally exhaling. She stopped on the road and looked at it. She thought about the contract with her name on the second line. She thought about Meridian, who had trusted her once in a frightened moment and had been trusting her every day since. She thought about a man who had said I was wrong to stay silent and then spent 3 weeks proving he meant it. She thought about her father, who had told her dignity was not something other people could give or take away, and who had been right about that even when she couldn't feel the truth of it. She could feel it now. She walked home through the last of the light with her hands steady and her back straight, and something opening in her chest that she decided this time she was going to let stay open. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. The ranch, the work, the town, the long ongoing negotiation of living among people who were doing their imperfect best the same as she was. But tonight, walking home under a Wyoming sky that had finally decided to be beautiful, Clara Whitfield allowed herself to believe quietly, privately, with the careful fullness of a woman who had earned it, that the best part of the story was still ahead of her. The harvest gathering came on the last Saturday of August. Red Willow held it every year in the field behind the church tables, set end to end. Whatever the summer had produced, laid out for the whole town to share the kind of event that looked like generosity and functioned as a social audit. Everyone came. Everyone watched everyone else. The hierarchy of who stood where and spoke to whom and brought what to the table had been calibrated over decades, and everyone in attendance understood the code, even if no one would have admitted to it. Clara had not attended the harvest gathering in 4 years. The last time she'd gone, she had spent 2 hours being talked around, rather than talked to, and she had driven home in the dark and decided that some traditions weren't worth the cost of the entrance. This year, Caleb asked her to come with him. He asked the way he asked everything, plainly, directly, without ornamentation. "I'd like you beside me," he said. "Not because it means anything to the town, because it means something to me." She said yes. She wore the blue dress, not the gray one, a dress she had made 2 summers ago, and worn exactly once, because it was too good for ordinary Sundays, and she had run out of occasions that felt worth it. She pressed it the night before with the same flat iron, but this time without the quiet resignation that usually accompanied the act. This time it felt different. This time it felt like preparation rather than habit. She met Caleb at the edge of the church field at noon, and when he saw her he took his hat off. Not as a gesture. As a reflex, the kind of response a man has when something catches him before he has time to arrange his face. "You look—" He stopped. "Don't," she said, but she was almost smiling. "I was going to say, you look like yourself," he said. "Which is what I meant." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took his arm and they walked into the gathering together. And Clara felt the shift in the air, the way she felt whether not with her eyes, but with her whole body, the awareness of a temperature change before it became visible. People noticed. Of course they noticed. This was Red Willow. But the noticing was different now. She had spent enough years cataloging the specific texture of this town's attention to recognize that what was landing on her today was not the old familiar weight of judgment and dismissal. It was something more complicated, something that had to reckon with a woman it had underestimated in front of witnesses. Yay. Delia Morrison approached first, which surprised Clara until she understood that Delia had probably been watching the gate for 30 minutes. "Clara." Delia's voice was warmer than it had ever been, which made Clara careful. "I wanted to say, my Abigail has been doing so much better with her reading since you started working with her. She talks about you every evening." "Abigail is a bright girl," Clara said. "She just needed someone to be patient with her instead of rushing her." Delia absorbed this without flinching, which was itself a kind of growth. "We're grateful," she said. Then, with slightly less rehearsed ease, "I also wanted to say I wasn't kind before. Earlier this summer. The things I said." "I know what you said, Delia." A pause. "Yes. Well." Delia smoothed her skirt. "I'm saying I was wrong about you." Clara considered this. She thought about her father, who had taught her that horses remembered everything, and forgave nothing that hadn't been earned, and that the earning took time, and was the responsibility of the one who had caused the harm. "I appreciate you saying so," Clara said. "Give Abigail my best." She moved on. Caleb beside her said nothing, but she felt the small pressure of his hand on her arm, a brief acknowledgement, and she thought, this is what it feels like to have someone stand with you. Not in front of you, not behind you, with you. She had not known before this summer that the difference would matter so much. The day moved the way good summer days moved, with the particular ease of people who had put down their burdens long enough to eat and talk and remember that they were neighbors before they were rivals. Clara found herself in conversations she hadn't had in years with the Garfield sisters about horse breeding with old Tom Wicker, about the creek levels with 3 women she barely knew who had heard about Meridian and wanted to know how she'd done it. She told them plainly, without false modesty and without performance, and she watched them listen with the attention of people who had revised their opinion and were interested in the revision. It was not a transformation. She did not trust transformations. They were too fast, too total, and too often they were simply the old contempt dressed in new clothes. What she trusted was this individual people choosing one at a time to do something different than they had done before. That was enough. That was in fact everything. She was at the far end of the tables talking to the Garfield sisters about a young quarter horse one of them had been considering when she heard the wagon. She knew the sound of Preston Vale's rig. She had heard it twice now, once at the ranch on that first evening, once on the storm morning, and the sound of it had developed a particular quality in her memory, the way certain sounds did when they carried associations the body remembered before the mind did. She turned. Preston was climbing down with the ease of a man who had not been told he wasn't welcome, which meant he hadn't been told, which meant Caleb hadn't known. She looked across the field for Caleb and found him already moving in Preston's direction, the set of his shoulders carrying the particular stillness that preceded his version of anger. She stayed where she was. She watched. Preston found Caleb at the edge of the gathering with the warmth of a man who had decided that the events of 3 weeks ago were simply a bump in an ongoing negotiation. "Caleb?" He extended his hand. "Good to see you. Quite a summer you've had." Caleb shook his hand because refusing it in public would have cost more than it was worth, and because he was a man who understood the difference between courtesy and surrender. "Preston," he said, "I didn't expect to see you today. Community event." Preston gestured broadly. "I have interests in this county. It would be strange not to come." He looked across the field to where Clara was standing and back to Caleb. "I owe you an apology, actually." Caleb said nothing. "What I said after the storm, the suggestion about Miss Whitfield." Preston's voice had the particular quality of a man who had practiced a speech and was now performing it. "It was clumsy. I should have framed it differently." "The framing wasn't the problem," Caleb said. Preston smiled. "Fair enough. Look, my investors are still interested. Hartwell and Briggs saw what they needed to see with the Stallion. The horse program is viable. The numbers work, and frankly, after what happened Friday, the operation looks more capable than it did before." He paused. "I'm prepared to come back to the table. Full investment, the terms we discussed." Caleb looked at him. "The terms we discussed included certain expectations about how the ranch operated and who made decisions." "Terms are negotiable," Preston said pleasantly. "Everything's negotiable." "Then here's my position," Caleb said. "The horse program operates under Clara Whitfield's direction, full stop. She has contractual partnership and full authority over that program. Any investor who has a problem with that can find another operation." He held Preston's gaze. "That's not a negotiating position. That's the condition." Preston's pleasant expression shifted slightly, not disappearing, but recalibrating. "She's that important to the operation." "She is the operation," Caleb said, "and she's more than that, which isn't your business. But the professional part is your business, and that's what I'm telling you." A pause. "That's a significant thing to say in public, Caleb." "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." Preston looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man running numbers he hadn't expected to run. "I'll speak to Hartwell," he said finally. "The terms you've described may be workable." "Good," Caleb said. "Let me know." He walked away from Preston Vale without waiting to see his expression, which was itself a statement, and he walked directly across the gathering toward Clara. And the people between them stepped aside without being asked the way people do when they sense something is happening that they should not be in the middle of. Clara saw him coming. She had watched the entire exchange from across the field. She couldn't hear it, but she had spent 37 years learning to read the architecture of conversations from a distance, the way bodies angled toward and away from each other, the weight of exchanges in the set of shoulders, and the movement of hands. She knew what had happened. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. The offer, Caleb's answer, the walking away. He stopped in front of her. He came with another offer, Clara said. Yes. And the same answer as before. He looked at her steadily. It'll always be the same answer. Clara held his gaze. Behind him, she was aware of the conversations that had quieted the faces turning toward them. The specific quality of attention that a small town gave to something it understood was going to be a story. She had spent her life being a story in this town. Always the cautionary version, the sad version, the version that made other women feel better about their own choices by comparison. She had made her peace with it, which was not the same as accepting it. Caleb, she said, what exactly are you doing right now? He took a breath. Something I should have done a long time ago, he said. Not for this town. For you. He did not get down on one knee. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. And what he did instead was something truer. He took off his hat, held it at his side, and spoke to her the way he always spoke, plainly, directly, without hiding behind anything. Clara Whitfield, he said, I am not asking you to save my ranch. I'm not asking you to make anything look respectable. I'm not asking you because you're useful or convenient or because any practical argument points in this direction. His voice was steady, and his eyes were on hers alone. I'm asking you because I have watched you stand straight under things that would have flattened most people. Because you told the truth when it cost you something, and you kept your dignity when this town made it as hard as it possibly could, and because every morning you walked through my gate you made everything on that ranch better. Not just the horse, not just the fences, but me. You made me better. A pause. I am asking you to stand beside me for the rest of our lives. Not because you need me to stand there, because I want you to know that you have been chosen openly, plainly, in front of everyone who once decided you weren't worth choosing for exactly who you are. The field was very quiet. Clara was aware of approximately 50 people who were not talking. She was aware of Ruth Halley standing 20 feet to her left, with both hands at her mouth. She was aware of Hank Deaver, for once in his life, finding nothing to say. She was aware of herself, her own heartbeat, her own stillness. The dress she had pressed the night before, because something in her had already known this was worth preparing for. She thought about her father's voice. Dignity is not something other people can give or take away. She thought about a frightened black horse pressing his nose into her open palm. She thought about 11 days of drought and 3 weeks of mornings, and a contract with her name on the second line, filed before she had agreed to it, because he hadn't wanted there to be any question about whether it was real. She looked at Caleb Dawson, this plain, stubborn, honest man who had learned in one summer to speak when it mattered, and she felt something settle in her chest, with the finality of a door closing gently on a room that had been cold for a very long time. You should know, she said, that I am not easy to live with. I have opinions about everything. I will argue with you when I think you're wrong, and I will never pretend to agree with something I don't agree with simply to make the day go smoothly. I know, he said. I will continue the school as long as I choose to, she said. The contract stays as written. My horses are my horses. I know all of that, he said. I'm not asking you to be anyone other than who you are. Clara was quiet for one more moment, not hesitating, processing, feeling the full weight of the thing before she picked it up and carried it forward. Then she said, yes. Just that. One word, plain as his proposal, direct as everything she had ever been. Yes. The sound that moved through the gathering was not applause. This was Wyoming in 1889, not a theater, but something shifted in the collected attention of 50 people, a release of held breath, a recalibration of the social mathematics that governed everything in a place like Red Willow. Caleb put his hat back on. He offered her his arm. She took it. And then something happened that Clara had not expected and would remember for the rest of her life. Ruth Haley began to clap. It was slow at first, uncertain the kind of gesture that required someone to go first, and Ruth had apparently decided, for reasons Clara suspected had more to do with Ruth's own reckoning than with generosity, that she would be that someone. And then Delia Morrison joined, and the Garfield sisters, and old Tom Wicker, and one by one, the gathering found its voice until the whole field was making the sound of a community that had arrived late and imperfectly at something it should have known a long time ago. Clara did not cry. She had known she would not cry. But she let herself stand in it for a moment, really stand in it, without the armor. Without the distance she had learned to keep between herself and anything Red Willow offered. And she felt the truth of her father's words all the way down. Dignity is not something other people can give or take away. But being seen by them, truly seen, that was its own kind of grace. An hour later, when the gathering had softened into the easy movement of a summer evening, Clara found a moment alone at the edge of the field. She needed it, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was a woman who had always needed to feel her own edges clearly, to know where she ended and the world began. She thought about September, when the school term would start again, and her mornings would run from the classroom to the ranch and back, full and purposeful, in ways she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. She thought about Meridian, who was in the barn at the Dawson Ranch right now, comfortable and untroubled a horse, who had come to Red Willow terrified and had found in the hands of one patient woman the language for trust. She thought about how her father would have looked at the contract at Caleb at the field full of people who had finally gotten around to seeing his daughter clearly. She thought he would have said something dry and understated the way he said everything, and that underneath it would have been pride so large it had to be spoken quietly, or it would have taken up all the air. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't speak. He had learned over 3 weeks when she needed quiet, and he honored it the way he honored everything between them, without making a performance of the honoring. After a while, Clara said, "My father would have liked you." "I'd have liked to know him," Caleb said. "He would have made you work for it," she said. "He didn't give his opinion of a man until he'd seen how the man behaved when things went wrong." "That seems like a reasonable standard. He saw a lot of things go wrong in his life," Clara said. "It gave him good judgment." She paused. "He used to say the best thing a person could do for a frightened horse or a frightened person was to stay present and make no sudden moves. Just be there, steady, until the fear found something better to do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone who understood people as well as horses." "He understood that they were more alike than most people admitted," Clara said. She looked out at the field, the tables, the lanterns being lit, as the evening came down the faces of people she had known her whole life, and would go on knowing imperfectly and honestly for the rest of it. "I've been frightened for a long time," she said. "Not of any one thing, just cautious, about hoping, about expecting anything to hold." Caleb turned to look at her. "I'm done being cautious about this," she said. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture for the people still in the field, just the plain and simple reach of a man who wanted to hold the hand of the woman beside him. His grip was steady, the way everything about him was steady. Clara held on. 3 weeks later, on the morning of the first day of September, Clara walked through the gate of the Dawson Ranch before sunrise, the same way she had walked through it every morning since the end of July. The ranch hands were not yet moving. The yard was quiet. She went to the barn and found Meridian awake, as he always was when she arrived, ears forward watching the door. She went in without hesitation. She ran her hands along his neck, the strong, warm, present weight of an animal that had come to her terrified and wild, and had found in her patience the thing he had been missing, the evidence that the world contained somewhere in it people who could be trusted. "Good morning, friend," she said. He dropped his head against her shoulder. Outside, she heard Caleb's boots crossing the yard. She heard the particular sound of his walk, unhurried, purposeful, and she heard him stop at the barn door, the same way he always stopped, giving her the moment before he entered the small, consistent courtesy that she had come to know as characteristic of who he was. "Clara," he said, "coffee's on." "In a minute," she said. She stayed another moment with Meridian, feeling the warm, steady weight of him, and she thought about everything the summer had cost her, and everything it had returned, and she understood clearly and finally, and without reservation, that the two were not in balance. What had been returned was greater. Not because the cost had been small, but because what came after it was real and solid and chosen, and hers. She gave Meridian a last pat, picked up her satchel, and walked out of the barn into the cool September morning, where Caleb was waiting with 2 cups of coffee, and the particular expression of a man who had everything he needed and knew it. She took the cup. She stood beside him. And in Red Willow, Wyoming, in the late summer of 1889, the woman they had called Unwanted stood in the yard. She had helped save next to the man who had chosen her openly and without apology, and she was completely, honestly, and without qualification, home.